We all know that effective internal communication is the secret to high-performing teams and companies. Did you know that according to a Tower Watson study, companies with effective employee communication tools see 47% higher total returns than businesses that communicate ineffectively? Beekeeper, a leader in employee communication, has developed an effective guide to help you understand your internal communications, especially if you work with a frontline team. Download Beekeeper's free guide today at www.beekeeper.io/crisis-averted-podcast. That's www.beekeeper.io/crisis-averted-podcast. Welcome to the Crisis Averted Podcast, produced by CJ Media Solutions. I'm your host, CJ Arlada. In this episode, I speak with Ronnie Gyani, founder of Gyani Ventures, host and producer of the Fear is a Liar podcast, and philanthropist. During our conversation, he shares the struggles he's faced throughout his entrepreneurial journey and how he's used the skills and relationships he's acquired over the years to overcome them. Feel free to send me your feedback at cj@cjmediasolutionsllc.com. Thanks for listening. Ronnie, thanks for coming on the Crisis Averted podcast today.
Sure thing, man. Thanks for having me.
So for listeners who aren't familiar with you, Ronnie, mind sharing a little bit about yourself and what you're up to now?
Sure, man. I've done a ton of things, and I continue to do a ton of things and wear many hats. So ever since I graduated from college, I have worked in the finance industry, working primarily on loans for multifamily developers. So think of developers who either buy apartment buildings, construct apartment buildings, refinance them across the country. Think of communities that are like 50 apartments up to like 500 apartments. So I've worked on financing for loans for those sorts of developers across the country since, call it maybe 2010, at various Wall Street financial firms. Throughout that time, I've tried to really take advantage of my entrepreneurial itch and open up a couple of small businesses. I think I mentioned to you in the past, convenience stores, also known as newsstands, throughout New York City, these tiny micro units on New York City sidewalks. That they kind of construct into the street corner. So I started off with one from scratch, and now I act in a lot of different capacities, from seed investor to partner to representative to just advisor for a lot of folks who have these stores, about 12 of them now. And it's been quite a journey, working through all the governmental bodies to get them approved, and all the delays and all the issues and the challenges to get one of these approved and constructed from start to finish. Usually takes about 2 to 3 years for one location. I probably failed at 50 to 100 applications before I got my first one approved coming out of college. So it has definitely taught me a lot along the way. In addition to that, I started a podcast about a year and a half ago called Fear is a Liar, inspired by Guy Raz on how I built this. I've listened to his podcast and many other podcasts over the years, and his format, or their format, really inspired me to start my show. And that within itself is probably one of the most challenging that I've ever, creative projects I've ever worked on, because that sort of a format is very difficult to do without a team and resources.
Ronnie, there's a lot to unpack. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ronnie.
Yeah, sorry. Do you want to go? I'm happy to just finish off there real quick.
Yeah, go ahead. You can finish.
Sure. In addition, I've made it a real mission of mine to be involved in philanthropy, and I've been involved with 3 different soup kitchens in New York City, where I've not only donated but raised funds through different organizations in a total sum of maybe $300,000 to $500,000 at this point over the years, to a food bank in Chelsea, in Harlem, also downtown Manhattan, and also working on microcredit loans for farmers and local small businesses in Cap Haven, Haiti. Funny story is that I heard a podcast about a professor who's involved in this program, called him up, and I got involved as well.
So, Ronnie, there's a lot to unpack there, but let's start with the convenience store story. How did you really get involved in that? And you said you were struggling initially. How did you overcome those initial hurdles? Did you have somebody to reach out to, a mentor? Did you begin doing research? Talk to me a little bit about that.
So I really had nobody, man. I was riding my bike to work on downtown Manhattan, and I saw one of these convenience stores. I don't know if it was '07, '08, or something like that, or '09. And I just saw the store, and I was enamored by the fact that there's this stainless steel convenience store on a street corner in Manhattan. And I was just like, I got to figure out how to get one of these. And that was it. There was no uncle. There was no mentor. There was no friend. There was no somebody in the business I knew. I mean, nothing.
Why did you want to get one of them?
Looking back, I was like, I want my own business. I don't know what that business is going to be. I want to be able to do something outside of just going to work. And it just fascinated me. Like, how do you get one of these tiny stores on a New York City street corner outside? And why? Yeah, I just wanted something different in addition to my day job. Like I said, that's probably what it was. It just fascinated me. And so I started showing up to one of the, it's like 5 governmental bodies that have to approve this. And I had no idea about any of this. And I just started showing up to where you have to apply and just asking tons of questions and just got tons and tons of rejection. And I just kept going back. And there was this one young guy who saw how persistent I was. And he said, listen, man, like, I don't think this is going to work out. There's attorneys, there's consultants, there's architects. There's so many players in this. And like, you're just this kid coming out of college. Like, this doesn't make sense, you know? And I was like, well, I just want to figure it out. And he said, all right, man, I'll do my best to help you out. But, you know, you did mention you got out of business school. Is there something you can help me with? I'm like, yeah, sure. He's like, I'm trying to get an internship, man. My cover letter, my resume is a mess. I'm like, listen, man, send me all that stuff. I'll do all of it. Just help me figure out the process. That's kind of how it started. So it was kind of started helping each other. And I realized it was way more than I had possibly imagined. You have 5 governmental bodies that have to approve it. You got to get an architect. You got to get plans. You got to prepare for an inspection. You got to go to a local community board meeting. And I just started going after it and failing. And I was really discouraged. I wanted to give up so many different times. And I just kept going back after it. Like, I learned this. I made this contact. I called my cousin who was in architecture school and asked him if he can do the site plans for me because I couldn't afford an architect. He ignored me. And then finally I was able to help him out with some projects. So he was like, fine, I'll do it. And it just became this thing, that I just kept doing in the background while keeping a day job, like nights and weekends.
I'm sure it was expensive too, right? The costs probably added up over time.
Oh, yeah, it was expensive. I mean, I was definitely spending my savings, and I was definitely asking people for favors left and right. And people were like, what are you doing? For the most part, they're like, we have no idea how to help you with this stuff. And then I remember going to one of the attorneys that handled this process in New York City, and he mentioned something along the lines of $10,000 to $15,000 to handle the whole process. And I'm like, there's no way I can do that. Like, it's impossible. So I went online. Back then, I was still pretty new to researching people to help you online, and I found architects and freelancers around the world on different websites, like, for example, Upwork, and now you have a bunch of other ones. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Sure.
But where freelancers are up there and they're willing to work, and around the world, it's much more favorable in cost for them to do it out there versus here, right? So I figured out a way to get the architecture, site plans and surveys and everything I had to get done at like a quarter of the cost that it was going to cost me. So like literally when site plans and everything was like maybe $5,000, I got it down to maybe $500 or $750. Wow. Yeah, and it was like wild. I mean, I had to go through all the revisions. I had to learn how to read the plans. I had to do all these things outside the norm, but I just decided to do them and try to be as resourceful as possible.
Yeah, and I mean, having to do all that, it seemed like you learned so much, every aspect of getting your foot in the door to get that first convenience store. I mean, if you had other mentors and people who were doing all the work for you, you wouldn't have learned that entire field.
Completely, man. And when I look back on it, I think about it like the more complicated something is, the more challenging something is. You realize you have to go through so many different steps, and those steps turn into touch points, and those touch points turn into lessons, right? So when I say that, I mean when I had to deal with New York City Department of Consumer Affairs, New York City Department of Transportation, New York City Public Design Commission, and an architect and the community board, they all have different criteria. They all have different review standards. They all have different documents. So if you figure out how to deal and navigate through these different touch points at an early age, or even later on in life, but ideally earlier on, then when you decide to start a business, or you decide to get a promotion at your job, or you're escalating in your career, your mind is basically, lack of a better word, more trained to take on vast amounts of information and steps, right? That you may have not have been had you not had taken on those challenges early on, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I feel like it was really started preparing me, and actually helping me in my day job in finance as well, but just in general, just to like take on a lot and process that, start making your own checklist, start devising plans, and start building a network of people that can potentially help you along the way.
How long did that entire process take for that first convenience store?
Okay. So I probably failed at about, I would say about 50 applications.
Wow.
For like 3 to 4 years.
Wow.
It just failed and failed. And the way it worked is throughout those 4 to 5 governmental bodies that had to approve, it was so crazy because you can get to step 3 and step 4 and each step approved. But if step 5 didn't get approved, everything was washed away. The time, the money, the effort, everything. So by failing so many times, I was learning every single time what was wrong in the process that I didn't know yet.
And you were also paying to learn it too.
And I was paying to learn it,
Yeah.
and I was learning real estate at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So when you're dealing with a New York City street corner, right, or any street corner, you have to figure out the dimensions. You have to look at the siting criteria of like within public safety standards, like how far you could be from a bus stop, a hydrant, a retail store, a firehouse, a school, all these different things. So you start getting into, I started learning real estate, like how this thing can potentially be constructed based on the city's public safety standards. So I kind of like went so far down the hole of spending time, money, and energy that I almost couldn't give up after that, because I was like, I got to make something out of this after years of going through that process.
And so how many convenience stores do you have in your portfolio right now?
So it's hard to say that I have, because I've acted in many different capacities over the years, and then those capacities and roles have kind of changed over the years. So whether I've been an advisor or a representative or a part owner or a seed investor, that's the roles I've played in about 12 different stores up to this point. And like I said, those roles have kind of shifted based on the location, based on the partner, et cetera, et cetera. And I've also just been an advisor for folks who just go ahead and apply for these things. And I can just kind of help them navigate through the process because of all the experience. And then as things have changed and criteria has changed over years, I can provide feedback on that as well.
And you spoke about how much you learned from that entire experience and how you've used that later on in life. How have you used that experience to help you get ahead in finance?
I think it's more the skills that have worked for me, in that, we could have a very complicated, affordable housing development. Let's say, for example, 200 unit property that that we're working on the financing for 200 apartments somewhere. And generally, when you're providing affordable housing, or a developer is looking to provide affordable housing, you're going to have multiple sources of not only approvals that will be needed, but financing sources. So you're not just generally going to get one loan from one bank or from a lender. You're going to have to get different grant processes approved, and then different funding from the city that you would get in there. So it'll be like multiple stacks of equity that would have to come in, and then all these different timelines that would have to coincide, and then also all the different financing that would have to achieve the proceeds that they need in order to either acquire or rehabilitate the property, right? So being able to be a part of financing like that, where I have had personal experience with how do I say this? Like with one, like let's say one store that I've worked on has had so many different timelines, so many different processes, so many different delays, and governmental bodies that have all these requirements. I think having that experience from these stores helped me understand what is necessary as far as a mindset, and as far as the training, as far as understanding that it's not overwhelming to have all these different pieces that have to come together to achieve a result, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it sounds like you've learned that process, and you've learned how to consistently overcome obstacles, because with a lot of those big development projects, like you said, there's so many steps, you're working with so many different players. And it sounds like that you've really used those skills to overcome a lot of that, and not be so intimidated by those steps and those players, and really have everything in line that you need to succeed.
I think so. I think that you hit on a key word, which is to be intimidated by it, right? So whether it be an investment I'm going to make, or investment I'm going to make, or investment I'm going to make in someone else, or a property myself, I think I've been blessed with some of the skills and experiences to be able to try to look at the proposal holistically, based on a lot of experiences I've had and a lot of financings that I've worked on, but then also having gained a network of people that I can call for different scenarios and say, hey, so this is how I'm looking at this investment and or project and or proposal. How are you looking at it? Because we've had this discussion on other projects where I value your opinion, right? So I really very much think all of these experiences add up to being able to navigate a process, a situation, an investment, a relationship, a proposal, if I haven't already said that, if that makes sense, right? And then also not letting roadblocks and setbacks like wipe you out, so to speak, right? So, I mean, I could be on the phone with you for 2 hours to tell you, just with the newsstands alone, like how many were going smoothly. We got approvals from the governmental bodies. We got approvals from the city. Everything was great. And then one roadblock after the other that just wiped out all the time, all the money. For example, the city decided to put in a bus stop at the last minute. And everything we did meant nothing because that supersedes it, right? A developer decided to demolish a building. And that takes precedent over a store coming in, even if you have all the approvals, right? The weight of one of these stores being constructed into the ground, even after you have all the approvals. So you can never be prepared for that, right? And then you have people who put in time and money and investment to that point, and it becomes a crisis, right? It's like, at the end of the day, you have to make sure that your partners, or whoever you have involved, understand the risks up front. And that at any point until, you get to the where you're trying to get to, or the goal, there could be something that could wipe it all out.
So we discussed the importance of a large network and using that network throughout your life. How do you continue to keep those relationships open, and how do you ensure it's not just a one-way street with those relationships, right? You don't want to continue going back to someone in your network and always asking them for things. How do you ensure that you're also giving back to your network?
I think there's two ways to always to maintaining those relationships and growing those relationships. And look, obviously, a lot of folks phase in and out of your network over the years, right? If you look over a 5 to 10 year horizon. But I think there's two ways that work for me to be able to provide value to them as opposed to always just leaning on them, right? So the first thing is you have to constantly be developing yourself, your skill set, your abilities, because the more you do that, the more you can provide value to them or to others, right? So that's number one. I feel like it's huge in networking. So you have to look at it as not only you're investing in yourself, but you're investing in what you can give. That's how I look at it, right? And the more you can give, the more people will value your time. They will value your energy. They will value your partnership. They will value your connection, right? And with the way the world is going now, which I'm so glad I finally got over the fear and or hesitation, is that with social media, you can so amplify what you offer the world or what you want to give to the world. So it doesn't have to be 1-on-1 or 1-on-10. You can just post and put it out there. And for those who resonate with it, they will then generally come to you, right? So I would highly recommend people who don't take advantage of that they do, to build their network based on this subject, right? And not only locally but globally. And then the second thing is try to make time. At least for me, I try to think about like making time in my schedule to give to others without expecting anything in return, right? So, and in order to give, you have to have skills, experience, background, interest in things that might be of use to others to give. So that could be anything, right? It could be anything. It could be helping someone with a problem in their house, to helping someone get a loan, to helping someone purchase a home or make an investment or whatever that may be. I'm just giving you like random examples,
Sure.
right? But like I constantly try to, like with the stimulus package, there's a perfect example, I guess I could say, is like I spend a lot of time learning about the EIDL loans and the PPP, not only because it would potentially benefit myself and or partners that I have, but because I'm genuinely interested, but I want to be able to take a lot of that information that's beneficial to others and summarize it into quick and easy, understandable, I guess I say, ways to communicate it in a much simpler way so that I can reach out to small businesses and say, listen, this is what they're really offering. This is how easy it is. You really should take advantage of this. And I think that's been a way that I could potentially provide value to others, right? And then, like I recently,
Ronnie, how do you? I that advice is great. I love that advice. You know, continuing your skill set, figuring out ways that you can add value to others. But how do you do that in a way where do you feel like you need to kind of stay in your field, stay in your lane a bit? Because the reason why I ask that is if you branch out to too many different things, how do you know that you're actually adding value to someone, and how do you know you're not that you actually are adding that value and not something that may or may not be correct or that could negatively impact them? How do you get over, and then on the other end too, how do you get over that imposter syndrome, right? That a lot of people have, that you start acquiring skills. How do you build that up enough that you feel confident to add value?
Okay. So let's start with the first one. If you could repeat it real quick again, just if you still have the thought.
Yeah. So, how do you ensure that when you're acquiring these skills, do you think that you should stay in a certain field in a certain lane, or do you think it's good to branch out to other fields as well? Because the fear is you're adding value that on your end you think you're adding value, but maybe you're not skilled enough to add that value. So how do you figure that out?
Okay. So I think we should almost never stay in our lane. I think, in my view, because by staying in your lane, you're really limiting your opportunities. You're limiting your skill set. You're limiting yourself from taking on something that in the future would be much simpler had you just tried it, right? At least in my view, this has been my experience. And had you and the only way to actually get out of that lane and take on new skill sets and new opportunities is by doing it, right? Is by literally by doing it. So, for example, I told you, like I genuinely took interest in PPP and EIDL loans and what the government's offering small business. But you want to, even if it's out of your lane, it has to be of interest to you. It can't be, in my view, just something you're looking to acquire skills just to provide value to others that you're not interested in. That in my thought is not going to ever work.
Gotcha.
Right. So if you constantly go for things that genuinely interest you, then when topics come up in your everyday life, you can then speak better about them and then potentially provide value to others. So as opposed to like, how can I help that person with that? I would look at it in another way, in that, what am I genuinely interested in where I can expand my skill set in? And then when the opportunity arises in one way, shape, or form, you can speak on it.
Got
right?
it. Yeah.
And so like a perfect example, I was at the diner near my house the other day, and the business owner was there. He had noticed I come in all the time with my daughter, and he mentioned something about government loans. And he had said, "Hey, man, I got first PPP loan. My bank told me they can't do the second one. It's a big mess." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, I've done that for like 5 different small businesses to help them out. I did it for myself, and I can be happy to help you with that." Right. So as opposed to like looking for someone to help, it kind of just arose. And because I had done it, I was able to provide value to this person, which made me feel really good. Right. And then that then naturally blends into building my network. Right. Naturally. But that's because I want to do that. You don't have to want to do that. That's just something that I would like to do. Right. So, and the imposter syndrome around it is, you're always going to have that imposter syndrome until you do it, right? Like I heard this somewhere, I don't even know where. Jeff Bezos was an imposter getting into the book industry, right? Bill Gates was an imposter getting into Microsoft, right? Everyone was an imposter. Elon Musk, Tesla, Rocket, like he wasn't in that world. Yeah. He wasn't. None of them were. And I just happen to mention men, but I can mention plenty of successful women that were imposters that flipped the script, right? But I think if you look at it that way, it kind of downplays the imposter syndrome, because we all are imposters in some way, shape, or form. You starting this podcast, you were an imposter in the industry before you got in, but now you're a podcaster with X amount of episodes in, right?
Yep.
So it's all in the doing. Yeah. It really is all in the doing, to where you basically are telling your mind that I'm no longer an imposter in this subject matter.
That's really overcoming a fear, right? So that's actually a great segue to talk about your podcast. Fear is a Liar, I believe it's called, correct? I got the title right?
Yeah.
So how did you start that, and why did you start it, Ronnie? What was and what were you inspired by?
Sure, man. So I've been listening to podcasts for maybe almost 10 years before I started my own. And one of the ones that inspired me the most was by NPR, by Guy Raz, who's the host, called How I Built This. And if you may or may not have heard the show, it's one of the most inspiring ones out there, where folks share how they started their business from nothing in so many industries across the world with so many well-known names in every industry. And I really always enjoyed the format of how they had that show, where they had voiceovers in the beginning, throughout, and at the end. And it really had a narrative storytelling format. And that really resonated with me, as opposed to, just for me, as opposed to just hearing an interview and folks speaking back and forth, which a lot of it is that too, but it adds a real storyline element to it. And I have realized, and by reading books and just doing a lot of self-discovery, that whether it's self-doubt, anxiety, depression, self-confidence issues, I've learned that all of these things throughout our personal and professional lives stem from one thing, and that is fear, right? So when you have that anxiety, when you have the self-confidence issues, when you have borderline depression or real depression, it generally, not always, it generally is based on a fear of something that may happen that has not happened yet, or a fear of something that's happened in the past that could happen again, potentially. And I'm very much simplifying this, right? Fear is a very large topic and a part of people's lives, right? So that's how I started realizing that, whether it be, coming from humble beginnings, growing up in New York City with parents who worked double shifts all the time, to being able to make it to college and bartend and be a busboy and work myself up the ranks in a restaurant through college, to getting an internship on Wall Street and then having the opportunity to become an analyst, associate, a VP, and just working myself up the ranks. I found that in all these different opportunities that I was blessed with, I always had an underlying fear that stemmed from self-confidence, self-doubt, different anxiety about what if I put myself out there too much, and it played a real role in my life, just like I feel like fear plays a role in all of our lives, personally and professionally, on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And so, as I kind of did a lot of self-discovery over the past few years, that subject matter, that topic really resonated with me, because I decided I really want to address and acknowledge and work on embracing my fears rather than having them control me, so to speak, right? Mm. And one way I felt I could do it is through a podcast in which I can ask people how they work through this in their personal and professional lives. So not only can I learn from them, but then I could potentially share those stories with others who might struggle with it and have a positive impact. And to bring it full circle, I was like, had this crazy idea of why not make it in a format like Guy Raz and How I Built This on NPR, which has been my favorite podcast, but I never realized that is the most difficult format,
of course,
probably I could ever find and think of.
That's why I'm not doing it. It is a very difficult format to follow. And I mean, you really have to be dedicated to it, and you got to have enough time and resources to really just sit down and do it.
Yeah. And so much of me was just like, how are you going to do this? Like, how is this even going to happen? Right? Like, no contacts, no resources, nothing. Never even been on a podcast, right? Let alone start your own. And I really, really was digging deep, and I'm like, I just don't know how I'm going to do this, but I know what I want. I have this vision of, I have the topic. I potentially have a network I could lean on, but I'm probably going to have to start from scratch, because I don't really know folks who go on podcasts. And how am I going to produce this thing? You have voiceovers, you have music, you have editing,
yep.
You have writing, you have preparation for the interview, you have booking the folks, you're getting them to say yes, booking a studio to meet them, then going there, doing it, then all the post-production that comes out of it, and then launching it and releasing it, right? So believe it or not, man, I tapped into the resources that I did with the convenience stores a decade ago, where I just went online and I just started posting late at night after work, outside of my whole life, late at night and weekends, just posting, I have this vision, and here's a couple episodes of Guy Rod's How I Built This, of creating a podcast based on this. Here's my content. I need music. I need writing. I need awesome production skills. I need someone to weave it together. And I just started finding freelancers in UK, in India, in Philippines, in Texas. I mean, all over the place, and basically paying them to help work with me. But when you have a production like that, you have like 5, 6 different pieces of production between music, voiceovers, writing, audio, everything, right? So it's not that simple. You generally can't just find one person as a one-stop shop to do this.
Right.
So that tapped back into like being able to take on layers of a challenge that have sub layers that have a ultimate holistic goal of putting them all together. And believe it or not, it's crazy, but it so relates to my almost 8 years of experience with the convenience stores, where you had all these different governmental bodies, all these requirements, other requirements within those requirements, different packages you had to put together to make them work, submitting them, understanding that it's not always going to be what it needs to be, and being able to like work with edits and work through it and details. And I started kind of tapping into those experiences and those skills and applying it to this process, and really bringing patience, because like the first 7 editors and writers that I found, they weren't producing what I had my vision of achieving. And it's not only time and energy and money, but that patience of like, it's not just going to come, because I don't have those resources, right? I have to build those resources. And slowly but surely, after tons and tons of edits and nights and weekends, started coming to what you hear now as I think I have 6 episodes out. But, even one of those episodes, it could take a month on and off to work on one of those episodes when you don't have the proper resources, right? Like NPR and Guy Raz has like maybe 5, 6 or more full-time employees that work on each episode, right? So that's not the case here. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that kind of is how it all came together. And I would take days off from work in order to meet folks to do the interviews.
Yeah. I mean, I just love that story and how it connects to any story that I really enjoy. I love when it just completely connects that full 360. So I think, you did that right here on the podcast, using those skills when you were talking about the convenience stores to see how you could fully execute your vision, your podcast vision, and publish it. So that's some really fascinating things for people who are interested in listening to your podcast. Where can they find it?
Sure, man. I'm on all major podcast networks. You can't miss it, from Apple to Spotify to Google Podcasts, and many others, right? But basically, you'll be able to find it just about anywhere. And lastly, I'll just say, man, I feel like it really, those experiences, those skills, and those moments, I've been able to thankfully really apply them to so many different ways. Like I had just recently had the privilege and blessing of getting my first mortgage on our house. And as you probably know, a single family mortgage is like no joke to get accomplished, as well as all the other challenges. But then it was that same thing, right? Like all these layers of things that have to happen, and not letting it overwhelm you because you've been able to do it in other ways, right? And then any investment I think about, or like my wife getting into nursing school, and all the different challenges that those are, and all the competition and all the different steps, and trying to help kind of navigate that for her, or do the best I can, right? Like the skills and lessons and experiences and the challenges that you are able to take on and then work through really will help you throughout your entire life, I feel.
Ronnie, thanks for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Sure thing, man.